And thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak. I spoke briefly for 2 minutes about this particular bill, but now I have the opportunity to speak in more depth, and I'd like to get right into it. So I'd first like to thank Minister Bethlenfalvy for your dedicated efforts in reforming Ontario's government with the proposed Bill 124, Protecting a Sustainable Public Sector for Future Generations Act 2019. The government is introducing the proposed legislation to ensure public sector compensation reflects the current province's fiscal reality. In spring of 2019, the government consulted with the provincial public sector employees and bargaining agents on how compensation growth can be managed in a way that results in a fair and reasonable path forward that will protect vital services and frontline jobs and workers. This is a fair, consistent and time-limited approach that applies across the entire public sector. Madam Speaker, before I get into the details of the proposed legislation, I would like to discuss the state of Ontario today. Due to 15 years of Liberal mismanagement, the province's net debt has grown to $360 billion, or in other words, the Liberals have nearly tripled our debt. This is the highest sub-sovereign debt in the entire world. The evolution of this number is a result of a regime that refused fiscal responsibility. For 2019 and 20, the government is forecasting $13.3 billion in interest payments to service that debt. It is deeply shameful that we have to pay $1.5 million every hour of every day on interest. It is the fourth biggest expenditure in our budget after health, education, and social services. Through the implementation of the debt burden reduction strategy, the government is protecting services that matter the most to people and helping it to ensure future generations are not left to deal with the burden of past financial mismanagement. Balancing the budget and restoring accountability to our finances is not just a fiscal imperative, it is a moral imperative. We owe it to our children and our grandchildren, who, for better or worse, will have to live with the consequences of the decisions that governments make today. In 2009, almost every province had a deficit. Today, provinces like Quebec, Saskatchewan, British Columbia have projected surpluses. Why should Ontario continue to be an outlier? I reiterate that Ontario is the highest sub-sovereign debt in the world. No other state, province, or municipality in North America is indebted as much as we are here in Ontario. Our debt is larger than the annual GDP of Portugal, New Zealand, Ukraine, Vietnam, Finland, and many more. It's no surprise that Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer has indicated that Ontario's current fiscal policies are simply not sustainable over the long term. Protecting frontline services, public sector jobs, and making Ontario fiscally sustainable will mean that everyone needs to do their part. Our government for the people will continue to work with all public sector employees, employers, and bargaining agents to protect what matters the most. Public sector compensation represents roughly half of all government expenditures, totaling $72 billion annually. Every 1% increase in compensation-related expenditures translates into $720 million in increased expenditures that we don't have. This legislation, Bill 124, if passed, would apply to bargaining and non-bargaining employees, managers, and leadership whose compensation is not otherwise moderated across the provincial public sector, including provincial authorities, boards, commissions, corporations, school boards, colleges and universities, hospitals, and the Ontario public sector. As drafted, it would not apply to municipalities, including municipal authorities, corporations, boards, or long-term care homes, the Ontario Medical Association Physician Services Agreement, or for-profit organizations. It would also not capture the broader public service executives covered by the broader Public Executive Compensation Act of 2014, whose wages have been frozen for much of the last decade. Existing collective agreements would not be revised based on the proposed legislation, and it would not impede the collective bargaining process. The proposed legislation would not impose wage freezes, wage rollbacks, or public sector job losses. Public sector employees would still be able to progress through salary ranges, be eligible for compensation increases, and be able to negotiate terms and conditions, including compensation. The proposed legislation, if passed, would limit future annual wage increases to a maximum of 1% per year for a 3-year period across the provincial public sector. This is about the future sustainability and protection of government services. We are taking these steps precisely so that we can protect frontline jobs and workers. If we did not take this action, tens of thousands of jobs as well as future services could be at risk, which our government refuses to do. The government conducted 6 weeks of good faith consultations with the public sector employers and bargaining aid spring of 2019 to explore how compensation growth can be managed in a way that allows for reasonable wage increases while protecting the province's frontline services, restoring the province's financial position, and respecting the taxpayer dollars. The government wrote to all stakeholders who participated in the spring consultations to review the draft measures and to continue to provide feedback on the proposed approach. For an additional 15 weeks over the summer, we continued to receive input from employers, partner ministries, bargaining agents, and other stakeholders. In-person sessions included participants from 68 employer organizations in sectors covering more than 2,500 collective agreements, 57 bargaining agents who collectively represent 780,000 workers across all sectors of Ontario's public service, and all major bargaining agents attended and participated in the consultations. Specifically, bargaining agents that participated in the public sector consultations included, but were not limited to, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, Canadian Union of Public Employees, Service Employees International Union, Ontario Nurses Association, Elementary Teachers Federation, Power Workers Union, to name a few. Specifically, employers that participated in the public sector consultations included, again, but were not limited to, the following sectors: colleges, universities, school board trustee associations, Ontario hospital associations, provincial agencies, to name a few. All in-person consultation sessions took place at publicly held facilities at low or no cost, and teleconference options were available to minimize travel-related costs to the representatives and stakeholder participants. Madam Speaker, at the Canadian Club, Minister Bethenvolve stated, quote, "Since 2003, Ontario's debt has increased by almost $200 billion. The question we must ask ourselves is, what did we get in exchange for this $200 billion debt burden? Is your life $200 billion better? The answer is no, not even close. From 2003 to 2013, public sector employment in Ontario grew an astonishing 27.6%, which dramatically outpaced the 5.6% private sector employment growth. Meanwhile, excessive public sector employment coincided with a period of dramatic increases in provincial government spending, rising government debt, and sluggish economic growth. Not a good combination. Our government views the economic sustainability of Ontario as both a moral and fiscal imperative. Without the fiscal health of the province, our schools will fall into disrepair, our neighbourhoods are less safe, and our loved ones will be treated in hospital hallways. In order to protect the services the people of Ontario rely on, we must act, and we must act now. This is a province in a building moment and an opportunity to do government differently. While we have begun to see results from our actions, we are nowhere near the finish line. We're proud of the responsible and measured approach we are taking and will continue to take, spending smarter and treating Ontarians' money with respect. The 2018-19 Public Accounts of Ontario showed that we inherited a deficit. Our deficit fell to $7.4 billion in 18-19, in part thanks to higher than anticipated revenues, as well lower than expected expenses. After years of negative credit ratings under the previous government, Ontario's credit rating has been returned to stable. While the public accounts show we are making progress, again, we are far from the finish line. The government still has a significant deficit, debt, an enormous amount of debt. As the great Edmund Burke once said, "If we command our wealth, we shall be rich and free. If our wealth commands us, we are poor indeed." We are paying $36 million every single day on our debt. That's $36 million we could be investing directly back into improving lives across the province. It's money that we could be using to build a stronger education program, better health care, or updated and modern infrastructure. Spending smarter means recognizing that every dollar government spends is taken from a hard-working Ontarian. It means we need to maximize the value of that dollar, looking at government expenditures in more critical ways and finding efficiencies that protect the long-term sustainability of public services. Like a household budget, Ontarians know that only paying half your credit card payment does not mean you're doing well financially. We are being honest with Ontarians. As a province, we have a long road ahead to get our financial house in order, but we are committed to staying on course. If we don't balance our budget, get our spending under control, and reduce our debt, the long-term stability of our province is at risk, and the services people depend on every day will also be at risk. To those who dismiss the warning signals, I know you know the value of money. We cannot go and borrow more. States that refuse fiscal responsibility and discipline provide painful consequences for its inhabitants. Look at Venezuela, Greece, or Argentina. The consequences of liberal fiscal mismanagement means we now have a higher debt-to-GDP ratio than New Zealand, Russia, Indonesia, and the Czech Republic. This government embraces the moral duty to be fiscally responsible. Our government aspires for Ontario to be a leader in global prosperity and economic growth. Madam Speaker, we want to be a shining example to the rest of the world and show how we are disciplined and responsible with our fiscal policies, which result in abundant prosperity for our inhabitants of this great province. Take a look at the fiscally responsible countries around the world: Norway, Switzerland, Denmark. Ontario has a higher GDP than these countries, yet they have a higher GDP per capita than we do. This is shameful and subpar for Ontarians. We should be doing better. We aim for the best, and this government embraces that culture. It means we need to maximize the value of that dollar, looking at government expenditures in new and more critical ways, and finding efficiencies that protect the long-term sustainability of the public services that we enjoy. This is about rebuilding a province that allows the people of Ontario to flourish. This is about building a future where, when our kids finish school, instead of struggling to find a job and putting their future on hold, Ontario's bright minds can put their creative talents to use and lead the world. A future where we enjoy world-class infrastructure and public transit, letting us get home to our families faster after work, no longer wasting hours on a hot subway or standing waiting on a cold railway track or for a bus. I must stress that if we are to enjoy the province's social services, we must have the courage to be fiscally responsible. Furthermore, we know that getting a handle on our fiscal state would require both short-term action and long-term planning. Madam Speaker, part of our government's commitment to fiscal responsibility and smarter spending included looking closely at how we do business. We need to find new ways to operate that enable us both to modernize and work as efficiently as possible. Members of this House will recall earlier this year, on March 18th, we announced a plan to save $1 billion annually by implementing smarter supply chain practices and reducing waste across government. When we assumed office, part of our platform, alongside a number of other cost-saving measures, was to centralize government purchasing. For far too long, smart supply chain practices in Ontario were being ignored. We saw a tremendous opportunity to better leverage the volume of purchasing across the Ontario public sector service and the broader public sector, ensuring that purchasing was more competitive in order to achieve the best value for the taxpayer. So our government looked at our supply chains and how we manage the flow of purchases across government. Ontario is now working diligently with stakeholders to start using leading supply chain practices and to determine the best way to centralize the province's public sector supply chain system and streamline back-office processes and services. We have done so because we are committed to transforming the way goods and services are purchased in the Ontario public service and broader public service on behalf of the people of Ontario. In doing so, we will better be able to leverage the government's buying power to realize significant savings, improve outcomes for end users by providing consistent access to high-quality products, and provide greater value for money for the program and services that Ontarians rely on. What's more, Madam Speaker, these initiatives have projected savings of $1 billion per year. This initiative is about responsible public administration that respects the millions of taxpayer dollars invested in the Ontario Public Service and broader public sector. From healthcare products like bandages and pacemakers to technical items like IT hardware and computers. Supply chain centralization requires long-term strategic thinking, and we have put in key initiatives in place to ensure this happens. Ontario is committed to building a modern, integrated public sector supply chain system that will drive significant cost savings across government and streamline purchasing processes while simultaneously making it easier for businesses of all sizes to work with government. At the end of the day, we are changing the culture of government. This is a change that is a long time coming and sorely needed. This is a change we are excited about. We are doing it in a way that helps us find solutions to Ontario's biggest challenges so that we can focus on the programs and services we all rely on. Our government is doing this for the people of Ontario. Madam Speaker, our government received a strong mandate from the people of Ontario to ensure we got our fiscal house in order. We promised we would change the culture of government, modernize it, and things would be done more effectively and differently. The expanded voluntary exit program that was made available by Mr. Bethlenfalvy for non-bargaining staff, managers, and senior executives of the public service began in December 2018. The key objective of this program included modernizing government, identifying areas for efficiency, removing duplication, offering employees more choice and flexibility regarding their individual career path, and directing taxpayer dollars towards frontline programs and services. The government's plan ensures frontline services and the workers who deliver them are protected. We received roughly 3,300 applications, to which 2,400 approximately were approved. The government has already decreased the size of the Ontario Public Service by 3.7% through voluntary attrition alone from June 2018 to April 2019. The estimated cumulative savings of these voluntary exit options are estimated to be approximately $317 million by the end of 2021-22. Planned efficiencies achieved through these exits are reflected as part of the government's fiscal plan and year-over-year growth rates in expenditures as reported in the 2019 budget. We promised the people of Ontario we would restore the fiscal health of this province, Madam Speaker, and due to the hard efforts of Minister Bethlenfalvy, we are well headed on that path again, but there is much more to be done. The government also quickly took a coordinated approach in managing expenses to ensure the programs are effective, affordable, and meet the needs of Ontarians. As part of that expenditure management, restrictions have been implemented for all ministries across the Ontario Public Service. These restrictions include a pay performance compensation arrangement for executives, managers, and non-bargaining staff, a hiring freeze with the exception of essential frontline workers, and a freeze on discretionary spending. Bold steps have been taken to address the March Madness spending that too often happens at the end of a government's fiscal year. March Madness is an unnecessary discretionary spending that increases the amount governments spend at the end of a fiscal year. To address this, Madam Speaker, the government has worked further to control spending by directing all ministries to limit commitments under contract, legislation, and/or requirements to fulfill core services up to March 31st, 2019. We realized cost savings of approximately $153 million in 2 months. All these expenditure management exercises are put to the taxpayer at the centre of everything the government does. It's about putting the structures in place that end a culture of waste and inefficiency. The government's approach will ensure that tax dollars go to the services to which Ontarians depend on. We have already seen significant cost savings because of these measures. Madam Speaker, our government is on the path to balance, but much more needs to be done. Things need to be done differently, leveraging technology, innovation, respecting the tax dollars, and eliminating inefficiencies. I was proud to hear that Minister Bethlenfalvy is implementing the SMART initiatives to ensure we will build a better government to work smarter for Ontarians in the 21st century. These are just a few things we are doing to put the government back into the right financial shape, and I'm excited to support Bill 124 as a result. Thank you.